Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I opened the Battle of Shiloh. Now the Union line crumbles under the weight of the Confederate attack. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Benjamin Prentiss and William T. Sherman had about a quarter-mile gap between their divisions, but it was the gap on Prentiss's left that would give him the most trouble. His entire division hadn't even gathered completely. Some of his troops had arrived the night before and some just that morning. The units that opened the battle from that division had harassed the Confederate juggernaut approaching their position. Sterling Wood's brigade drove directly east through the south end of Ray Field as the rest of the corps swung north, and this caused the thinly defended Union line to buckle against the weight, and they took up a position closer to their encampment. But the terrain didn't offer any advantage like that of Sherman's division. The Union troops could see for a greater distance in this sector, but that was the extent of their superiority. Confederate bullets tore into Prentiss's ranks, and he urgently sent messages to the other division commanders to send what they could to his aid. A little after 8:30 a.m., confusion struck the Confederate ranks. According to Robert Shaver, a unit in Wood's brigade panicked, causing the regiments from both brigades to fall back. But Wood insisted in his report that Shaver's men had been the first to break. Either way, the greenness of the Confederate army, many of whom had never been in battle, contributed to this kind of event happening all over the battlefield. The Confederates regrouped and pressed on against the Union line. Adlai Gladden's men ran into difficult terrain, and the 26th Alabama was forced to move to the right of the line to avoid the entanglement of the undergrowth. They would have to attack Miller's brigade and two batteries of artillery, the 5th Ohio Battery and the 1st Minnesota Battery, sitting astride the road. Because the field of vision was small for the batteries, one artilleryman stated that they had to fight them within pistol range with only canister and quick-time shells. As the Confederates advanced, Prentiss rode over to Madison Miller's brigade and told them to fire low. When we shot, be sure that we seen something to shoot at. For every Secesh that we killed, there would be one less to shoot at us. Gladden led his men into very close combat. One soldier stated, "We ran up near enough to be certain that our balls would reach them." Getting that close to the enemy came with heavy casualties, including Gladden himself, when a shell fragment hit his shoulder and nearly took off his left arm. A doctor would amputate that arm, but after being transported to Corinth, Gladden would pass away. Bragg's battle line appeared on the field in that sector, with Randall Gibson's brigade and John Jackson's brigade supporting Wood, Shaver, and Gladden, while Chalmers' brigade extended Gladden's right. This reinforcement would help relieve the pressure from Gladden's beleaguered troops. Chalmers ordered a left wheel to find the Union flank and hopefully turn it. The 15th Michigan, guarding that flank, was horribly under strength due to a number of soldiers being sent to guard the equipment in the rear, and it was without ammunition. When its commander brought that up to Prentiss's attention, the division commander stated, "Our bayonets ought to be good for something." The Michiganders could only watch as the Mississippians and Tennesseans unleashed a hail of lead into their ranks with no way to respond. It didn't take long for them to break. Chalmers' men continued down the Union line, next coming in contact with the 18th Wisconsin. Chalmers ordered a charge, but only the 10th Mississippi heard the order and dashed against the 18th Wisconsin. Seeing their comrades on the move, the 9th and 7th Mississippi regiments followed. Now the Badgers were retreating. One Wisconsin soldier wrote in his diary, "We passed our encampment. I saw some breakfast cooked ready for eating, of course. I did not sit down, but ran up and took a pancake or biscuit. It served me for the day." Gladden and Shaver's brigades pressed Miller's regiments to its limit until it broke under the pressure, sending the blue-clad troops north, toward Pittsburg Landing. As the Confederates advanced over the blood-soaked battlefield, a Tennessean commented that he saw some of them with their brains shot out, and 2 or 3 in a pile. Some had their limbs broken and begging to have their wounds dressed. Others cursing the man that wounded him, and some few was making peace with heaven. One Confederate, Sergeant George Dixon, was hit in the leg and was saved only by a gold piece he carried in his pocket. His sweetheart had given him the piece, and because it saved his life, He later had the bent coin inscribed, "Shiloh, April 6, 1862, my life preserver," and his initials, GED. The coin was found nearly a century and a half later on Dixon's body inside the recovered submarine, the CSS Hunley. Peabody's men were still holding, but not for long. When Wood and Shaver advanced in a renewed attack, they too got scattered. Peabody tried desperately to reform his men. He had been hit 4 times, in the hand, thigh, neck, and torso, but was still barking orders until a bullet slammed into his face just above his lips, killing him instantly. Some of Prentiss's men went in a dead run back to the landing, and some even attempted to swim across the Tennessee River. One staff officer asked a retreating soldier why he was running. The soldier replied, "Because I can't fly." Around a half a mile behind where his front line was, Prentiss was able to form a group of 500 stalwarts to offer some resistance and hold off long enough for the rest of the army to arrive. Many of the Union surgeons stayed with their patients in the newly abandoned camps. Confederate Brigadier General Thomas Hindman ordered those doctors to not be disturbed by the advancing rebels, and 2 rebel surgeons began dressing the wounds of both sides in the encampment. Confederates began to sit down and eat the prepared breakfast left by the Yankees. They read the personal letters from sweethearts and, in general, plundered the camp with some reports of Confederates bayoneting the wounded or sick in the hospital. Johnston himself approached the encampment and quickly got the army back in order. From the abandoned Union camps, Johnston formulated the plan that would have huge repercussions for the Confederates in this battle. He thought he had turned the Union's left flank. What he didn't know was that there were more divisions to the east and northeast. Therefore, he ordered his men, who had just broken Prentiss's line, to advance to the northwest, hopefully to sweep up the rest of the Union army. As his men began their swing, this put pressure on Sherman's brigades and scattered them. Then Johnston realized his mistake in believing he had turned the Union left flank, so he quickly ordered 2 brigades that were closest to him, Chalmers and Jackson's, to follow General Jones Withers to the rear and then march back up the Bark Road. But this created a huge gap in the Confederate line. He now had to order in the reserve corps under Breckinridge to fill that gap. Johnston's army was now awkwardly positioned with multiple weak points along the line. These weak points would play a significant role in the next sequence of events. The morning was passing away quickly, but there was much fighting left to do. William T. Sherman and Benjamin Prentiss had delayed long enough for the divisions of John McClernand, Stephen Hurlbut, and W.H.L. Wallace to form a defensive line against the oncoming Confederates. Albert Sidney Johnston was all over the field, directly controlling the brigades and regiments as he saw fit. He personally deployed John C. Breckinridge's command into the Confederate center and even made his way over to John Jackson and James Chalmers' brigades on the Confederate far right. What he saw boosted his confidence in a victory. In that sector, Jackson and Chalmers would face the lone brigade of Colonel David Stewart, made up of 3 regiments. Stewart was an inexperienced commander, and his troops were inexperienced, but he knew the importance of his flank to the Union Army, and ordered his regiments to cover a wide front. Jackson's brigade reached Stewart first and easily overwhelmed the Ohioans. Chalmers entered the fray, but the 54th Ohio delivered such a destructive fire against the 52nd Tennessee that all but 2 companies from that regiment broke and ran. Chalmers commented that he repeatedly attempted to rally the Tennesseans, but to no avail. The 2 companies that withstood the hail of lead fought the rest of the battle with the 5th Mississippi. Though the 54th Ohio was protected behind a fence and underbrush, the Confederate brigade forced them back. Next, the 55th Illinois stood in Chalmers' way, but the rebels quickly overwhelmed the single regiment. Stewart organized a disjointed defensive line that would hold out for a little while, but would be forced back too. Ulysses S. Grant had been working feverishly all that morning. He attempted to eat an early breakfast and meet with General Don Carlos Buell that morning, but the battle altered those plans. Grant, halfway through breakfast, got word of heavy artillery fire coming from one of the landings. He immediately sent word to Buell's divisions to hurry forward, in particular William Bull Nelson's division, which had already made it to Savannah. He sent Nelson to Pittsburg Landing and then stepped aboard the steamboat Tigris and met with Lew Wallace. Grant told him to watch his western flank and await further orders. Next, Grant steamed toward Pittsburg Landing He arrived at around 8:30 a.m. to a fairly calm scene, but after conferring with W.H.L. Wallace, he understood the situation developing in his front. He had been surprised before, especially at Fort Donelson, but like his actions in that battle, he remained calm, cool, and collected. His first steps were to organize the forces around the landing and send them to aid the frontline troops. Grant then sent orders to Lew Wallace to move toward Pittsburg Landing. The commanding general rode to the front and declared that the key to the survival was nightfall. If he could delay the Confederates until darkness covered the battlefield, his reinforcements would be enough to launch a counterassault. He said as much to his aide. "We've got to fight against time now. Wallace must be here very soon." Grant's army had fought for 6 hours. Johnston had sent in almost his whole army to move 2 Union divisions out of the way. For the Confederate corps commanders, their brigades were mixed up and fighting as individual components. Those commanders devised a plan to bring some order to the brigades, but ultimately confused the matter even worse. Hardee would command the far left. To his right, Polk would command those brigades. Next, Bragg, and finally Breckinridge, would control the far right brigades. Once the plan was hammered out, then each corps commander had to inform the brigades in their individual sectors of the change, which only brought more confusion as to who individual brigades would answer to. To add to the chaos, now division commanders who normally controlled brigades would be in a limbo state, with their respective brigades displaced all over the field and answering to different corps commanders. The stiff resistance put up by Sherman, and to a lesser extent Prentiss, afforded the Union divisions under Hurlbut and McClernand enough time to put forward their brigades as a defensive line and a safe haven for the brigades of Prentiss and Sherman to reform behind. Much of the next phase of the fighting would occur around a crossroads of the Corinth Road and the Hamburg-Purdy Road. The Union brigades had filed in and around the two roads, hoping to delay the Confederates further. The fighting force that Johnston brought to the battlefield just hours earlier wasn't the army now attacking for a second time. Brigades were shot to pieces. Patrick Cleburne's men basically wouldn't move from their position around the Shiloh church. The same went for a host of other regiments who had been bloodied in multiple assaults against Sherman's line, and they failed to move out when ordered. When some of the Confederate brigades did move in a confusing mass against the Union line, multiple instances of friendly fire erupted. On the Union right, Colonel John McDowell's brigade was the flank and would be stunned when they saw the amount of Confederates pouring into the Ben Howell field to their left and subsequently into the gap between his own brigade and Buckland's. To avoid being completely cut off from the rest of the army, McDowell pulled back, but this would compromise the integrity of the Union flank, since Pond and Anderson could now fire into Buckland's exposed flank. Buckland's brigade was hit in the flank and forced to fall back, just like McDowell had done. Further to the east, the Union brigades of Wraith, Marsh, and Hare, with an exposed right flank, would be hit by elements of 6 brigades, but to their credit, they held their ground long enough to further bloody the already depleted Confederate ranks. Both sides took heavy casualties, with the 20th, 11th, and 48th Illinois all losing the regimental commanders. The 27th Tennessee lost its colonel, lieutenant colonel, and major in the fighting. Their brigade commander, Sterling Wood, was thrown from his horse and dragged through the Federal encampments that the rebels had just captured. It would take him hours before he recovered. Wood's large brigade, with few officers and a confused leadership, became disjointed, and many of the regiments would fight independent from their brigade for the rest of the battle. Brigade Commander Alexander Stewart rode up to the commander of the 4th Tennessee, Otho Straw, and asked if he could take the 1st Illinois Artillery Battery D, under Captain Edward McAllister. Straw responded by saying, "Show us where it is. We will try." The 4th advanced to within 30 paces against the battery after taking a few artillery rounds into its ranks, fired one volley, and then charged. McAllister was wounded 4 times by the Tennesseans, but was able to escape with a few of his guns. The stress placed on the makeshift Union line prompted McClernand's brigades to pull back. Thankfully for them, the Confederates were too disorganized and shot up to launch an immediate pursuit. Johnston's left wing had pushed back Sherman and McClernand's divisions, but the 2 Union generals were able to reform their men. The blue line hadn't scattered, but simply swung back with its hinge on Thomas Sweeney's brigade. Sherman and McClernand were now faced with a decision to make. The Confederates weren't pursuing at the moment. Should they withdraw back to the landing, stand and wait for another Confederate attack, or launch a counterstrike? There was only one real answer. They must attack and delay the Confederates as much as possible. It was between 11:30 and noon when the blue line stepped off in their counterattack. This caught the rebels off guard completely, with Sherman and McClernand nearly taking up their former position near the crossroads. One of the very last reserve brigades under Colonel Robert Trabue, the brigade that would become the famous Orphan Brigade, was ordered to the front. It took up a position between Anderson and Russell's brigades and offered a stiff defense against the oncoming Federals. The counterattack bloodied the already exhausted rebels, but Sherman and McClernand couldn't hold out forever. The fight lasted nearly 2 hours, and at that point Sherman and McClernand decided to pull back their brigades. Johnston's left wing pursued slowly and cautiously, but did little to hinder the withdrawing Federals. Many of the Confederate regiments were running low or out of ammunition, and soldiers had to pack boxes of cartridges on their backs over the dense and boggy terrain to their respective units. Further to the east, Hurlbut's men were in a defensive position in a peach orchard, where the Confederate right wing would soon engage them.